Chapter 4. Torrijos, the man, the secret plan, and the canal. If there was one thing that was self-evident to Panama under Omar Torrijos, it was that we could not be free while the Panama Canal was owned and occupied by the United States government. We could no longer tolerate the conflicts caused by U.S. control of the canal. It led to espionage, assassination threats, intrigue, political pressure, and the threat of an invasion. Understanding the relevance of the canal both to Panama and to the United States is important for anyone analyzing U.S. policy and the developments that provoked the 1989 invasion and my capture. The canal cannot be separated from any political or economic contact between Panama and the United States. We cannot forget that there were those in the United States who wanted to block the canal treaties at any cost. There were those who believed passionately that American interests would be damaged by Panamanian sovereignty over the canal. And even after the ratification of the canal treaties, American conservatives believed that the canal had been sold out and that it was their right to get it back. With all the pressure against us, successful completion of the Panama Canal treaties was certainly Torrijos' greatest achievement. The treaties involved a combination of skillful negotiations, various pressure tactics, and help from unexpected quarters. First, there was help from Japan, which took on almost mystical significance after the visit of Dr. Daisaku Ikeda, leader of a religious philosophical movement known in Japan as Soka Gakkai International, the true Buddhism. The movement has branches around the world, including adherents in the United States and in Europe. He was a brilliant man, and he came to us via contact with my judo and martial arts instructor, Professor Chu Yi, the Soka Gakkai representative in Panama. I was so impressed with Dr. Daisaku that I told him to meet General Torrijos. Dr. Daisaku described his spiritual vision of the world in the year 2000. And in that context, he thought that the peaceful transition of the Panama Canal to Panamanian control was vital to world peace. He predicted that the Pacific Rim would be very important in the next millennium, and that Panama could be a centerpiece in a new world order, both commercial and cultural. He saw Panama's role as a bridge crucial in the development of these links. He recommended that Torrijos seek alliances beyond the traditional sphere of American influence, and that we turn our attention toward Asia. It was a long discourse, 4 hours or more, culminating in a prayer led by Dr. Daisaku. "Do not waste time fighting for what you already have," he said. "Expand your horizons. The world of the future is in the Pacific, and you have made no contact with the people of the Pacific." This was definitely the starting point for changing the orientation of what Panama was about and thinking about involvement with Japan. At the time, of course, the treaty negotiations had hardly begun and had borne few concrete results. We needed to consider other options. By turning our attention to Japan, we were being practical. We were also pressuring the United States. Japan was keenly interested in the expansion of markets to Europe and the Americas. Entry into Panama and the possible participation in a new canal could have profound impact on their global economic growth. The idea of Japan participating in or financing an alternative to the Panama Canal drove the Americans wild, but our conversations were logical. Japanese businessmen, led by a man named Shiego Nagano, formed a chamber of commerce called the Japan-Panama Friendship Association to promote relations with Panama. They discussed with us the possibility of creating either a land-based alternative or an entirely new passage, a sea-level canal that would supplement the existing canal to conform to the needs of growing maritime trade and Pacific trade in general, with larger and larger vessels in the 21st century. Mention of this possibility was included in Article 12 of the Panama Canal Treaty, in which it was specified that Panama could join with other partner countries in such an enterprise. The fact was that Panama had already chosen its additional partner, and that partner was to be Japan. The United States accepted this in the form of a treaty, but never liked the idea. We entered serious negotiations with the United States on the canal during the Ford administration, but there was little progress. By 1976, we were growing frustrated. The Republican administration was maintaining a hard line in the talks, and there was no certainty that the talks would be successful. Torrijos, committed to winning the earliest possible treaty for eventual surrender of the canal to Panamanian control, saw that both sides were just spinning their wheels. He had a plan to open things up. He trusted neither American politicians nor the U.S. military. blaming both for the 1969 coup that almost ousted him from power. But he saw the CIA in a different light, as perhaps being more pragmatic, even while supporting and being part and parcel of the American government. He knew that the U.S. view on the canal treaties was divided. While on the one hand, there was strong conservative colonialist sentiment in the United States that the Panama Canal was a strategic necessity, there was, on the other hand, a recognition that it was untenable to maintain the canal zone as a U.S. outpost forever. Many politicians in the United States, living through Vietnam protests and watching the development of liberation movements in Latin America, were rightly frightened that student protest movements in Panama would turn increasingly violent and produce a guerrilla problem they could not afford. As luck would have it, Omar found a sympathetic ear at the Central Intelligence Agency. We had close relations with the CIA for years, and both Torrijos and I felt comfortable with the succession of CIA station chiefs posted in Panama City. It should be noted that it was not at all unusual for world leaders to talk directly with the CIA. It was the natural order of things in dealing with the United States. So Torrijos went to the CIA station chief, Joe Kiyonaga, seeking a back channel for advice concerning the canal question. He asked for total secrecy and isolation from the U.S. Embassy and from Panamanian and U.S. negotiators. This was a request that, he reminded the CIA operatives, had its precedence. The agency had in the past been able to set up off-the-record operations with Panamanian help, especially when it came to diplomatic dealings with Cuba. The CIA man took detailed notes and said he would get in touch with Washington. Within a week, Kiyonaga was back, accompanied by an envoy from CIA headquarters and ready to meet with General Torrijos. A secret meeting was set up at the Hotel Panama in downtown Panama City. The envoy, a Spanish speaker, needed no translator for the top-secret personal message he said he was delivering from George Bush, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Kiyonaga and I were there to hear the message. The envoy said Bush agreed with the need to push the talks along to a successful conclusion. The future president had not yet undergone his conservative metamorphosis. He agreed with those who said it was best to reach an agreement and turn the canal over to Panamanian control. The CIA envoy's suggestion was to raise the political stakes and, recognizing that it was election time in the U.S., create the impression that it was too dangerous for the U.S. to protect the canal zone. The problem was that the American residents of the canal zone, called Zonians, were successfully lobbying in the Congress for their rights. Many Americans saw the canal zone as God-given U.S. territory and even raised the possibility of admitting it as the 51st state. These expatriate Americans were claiming sovereignty over foreign soil. It was a story of colonialism gone awry. The Zonians, led by an activist named William Drummond, were mobilizing an advertising campaign in the United States that stirred up anti-treaty fervor on patriotic grounds among key senators and congressmen in Washington. The possibility that the canal zone might remain a permanent U.S. enclave had always been opposed by Panamanian nationalists, and the problems in promulgating a canal treaty had spawned a new generation of anti-U.S. activists, young nationalistic protesters who rejected the U.S. presence in Panama. The students had begun staging small-scale demonstrations and militant acts around the Canal Zone PX and post office. What if, the Bush emissary suggested, the protests were suddenly to become violent and the Zonians' plea for statehood were to be overwhelmed by the worst fears of the Americans, that a guerrilla and terrorist war was brewing in Panama? The CIA proposal was to bring a group of Panamanian military men to the United States, train them in explosives and demolition tactics, and then send them back to the Canal Zone for a high-profile but harmless bit of sabotage in the Canal Zone, which would add urgency to the canal negotiation by questioning the security of American residents in the area. Torrijos liked the plan. He selected a group of 10 or 11 men for the top-secret mission. Their prime directive was to be inconspicuous, to be good soldiers, and to keep their mouths shut. They were sent to Washington, all expenses paid by the CIA. In Washington, they were fingerprinted and photographed, blindfolded for a trip to an airport, then sent off on a night flight in a plane with its windows darkened to undergo 3 weeks of training. Participants in the training session said they were never told where they were and could only surmise that it was within an hour or so from Washington, perhaps an island or a cove close to the Atlantic coast. The training camp was well equipped, with classrooms for theoretical training along with all sorts of equipment and field instruction. There was a small club and snack bar for after-hours recreation. At the end of the 3-week course, the men were given a final exam, which was a mock exercise on a training course to show they were ready for what lay ahead. The newly trained commandos arrived in Panama under the leadership of a Spanish-speaking American Army sergeant. The sergeant had received explosives training in Vietnam and was a member of the Green Berets, stationed in Panama at Fort Sherman. The sergeant's job was to target some locations for bombings and to assure that the mission did not cause any injuries. The first step for the commando unit was a week of review and mission training. They were kept isolated in an area of abandoned buildings on the Atlantic coast, where they could conduct their dry runs in secret. Ironically, the sergeant had to revise the mission when members of the Panama Student Federation started conducting small-scale operations on their own, including a firebomb attack on a car in the Canal Zone. The revised mission now included operations outside the main zone area. The American sergeant and our men placed small explosive charges at 14 locations on the Atlantic and Pacific sides. The number 14 was chosen by Torrijos to represent a protest to the presence of all 14 American installations in Panama. They left political leaflets at each site. As planned, no one was injured and material damage was slight. The U.S. Ambassador William Jordan, who had been kept out of the loop of the CIA operation, reacted quickly to the bombings, contacting Aquilino Boyd, the Panamanian foreign minister, lodging his note of concern and warning that he had information that the National Guard was behind the bomb attacks. The head of the Southern Command, Lieutenant General Dennis Phil McAuliffe, was circumspect and reacted mildly, making no public remarks about the bombings. Boyd delivered the ambassador's protest to Torrijos, who immediately asked for a meeting with Bush. He sent me to Washington as his envoy to meet with the CIA director. My first face-to-face contact with Bush ended up being a subtle charade, in which we both knew that the other was not supposed to reveal the substance of the little intelligence operation we had set up. At the same time, Torrijos wanted me to send a tactic message to the Americans that we would not tolerate being the fall guy for the political agenda. We would respect operational security on the bombings if they would keep the heat off us.